Welcome to the new sound of online radio. Welcome to the sound of Universal Broadcasting Network.
'Cause you make me feel like I've been locked out of heaven.
A mix of today's hits and hard-to-find favorites, combined with the most entertaining and intriguing talk anywhere. This is your sound. This is the sound of Universal Broadcasting Network at UBNradio.com.
You're listening to the Dr. Dee Show about neuropsychology and well-being. Get the knowledge you must have to live a powerful, positive life. The Dr. Dee Show. Here for you.
Welcome, listeners, to the Dr. Dee Show. It is wonderful to have you with us today on this lovely Thursday afternoon. As usual, our disclaimers. This show is psychoeducational in essence. It's not meant to replace professional mental health advice or therapy. If you do believe that you suffer from a particular disorder, please do reach out to professional help. With that in mind, the topic of today is going to be apropos to a personal change that's coming my way that I'm going to announce today. So stay tuned with me. We are going to talk today about do together a review of the some of the most influential psychologists that changed the world. And we're going to talk today about one particular scientist and neuropsychologist, Alexander Luria, that has changed the field of neuropsychology. Now, many psychologists and neuropsychologists have had an incredible impact on the world. But so many of us or laymen will never know. That goes for any other type of field, right? We've got individuals inventing amazing things every day that change people's lives and improves people's lives. So we are truly, truly in debt to the many wonderful people in the world who their creativity, their out-of-the-box thinking, their sacrifice, and the time, the endless hours, days, and years that they spend of their life to do something incredible to benefit society. So today we are going to pay tribute to some of those individuals and touch on a couple of interesting letters that I received from listeners, touching on a couple of topics that I think are relevant to many individuals. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to do that review. We're going to talk about the letters, and I'm going to make an incredible announcement. First, I would like to address just the topic or area, psychology. We all know what psychology, or have an idea of what psychology is about. But various types of individuals gravitate towards the field of psychology. Is it because they want to help the world? They want to help populations? Is it because they themselves are suffering from psychological issues and try to make sense of them, try to understand themselves? Is it because they believe that they have an insight to what other people go through, and they think that they can, that they're in that regard, that they are talented and can help the world with their insight into the well-being of humanity? Or is it that they are voyeuristic and truly enjoy or gravitate towards listening to another person's story, another person's experience, and that is something that's just very enjoyable and attractive to them? Sometimes one contend that these are all come in all various of combinations to describe individuals who become professionals in the field of psychology and mental health. Very many psychologists every single day help many patients. I know, being in the field, that there are so many stories of support and care and management of struggles and severe cases and situations that no one will ever know how those incredible moments have occurred. It is a private story. It is the individual's story. Many of us also might not realize how difficult it is, how challenging it is to work with individual psychological care. There's always, I feel there's like at least three areas where everybody knows something about. And if you go into those areas as a professional, you are doomed to be blamed for one thing or another. You know what those areas are? One of them is psychology. Almost every other person believes that they know psychology very well, at least just as much as the psychologist next door. Almost every person feels that they know and they are entitled and they are experts in spirituality, right? And almost every person believes that they are knowledgeable to some extent with money or with finances. And it's sort of like areas that if you go into them as a professional, you need to expect, oh, wait, there's one more, politics. Almost everybody knows, feels themselves as they are experts or knowledgeable enough about politics. But the wise ones of us know that our knowledge is limited and that if we want to do best and know best in a particular field, we are going to hire and get the experts that are excellent in that particular field. And by that, we become smarter and make better decisions. So knowing how to utilize another person's knowledge for your own growth and benefit is not just an act of humbleness, but it's a wise act. It is the smartest way one can go about maximizing best decisions in life. Psychology has dramatically changed the world in very many ways. Psychology is in various areas of functioning. We've got psychology in obviously mental health and individual care. But psychology also has an instrumental part in understanding violence, criminal behavior, and resistance to law. Psychology helps us understand motives of people, why people do the things that they do, and therefore understand not only the microeconomic patterns, but the macroeconomic patterns of our society. Psychology sometimes helps us understand and explain historical changes. Psychology helps us understand spirituality and religion. Psychology helps us become better businessmen by understanding the interests and trends of individuals and their wants. So, psychology is extremely, extremely powerful in our lives. When we talk about one of the leaders of psychology, one of the number one names in the field of psychology that you could say controversial, you could say ridiculous, you could say brilliant. And most would say that, of course, especially based on his time, when his ideas come aboard, it was just absolute brilliance. And I'm talking about Sigmund Freud. So we all know about the Freudian slip, and why do we call it the Freudian slip? Is it because when you say that, it means that maybe there is some truth to it? Maybe that little slip of language or that word you misused really was in some way intended to use because it's a clue or a door into a deeper internal process. The name Sigmund Freud has been very, very famous. He pioneered investigation into how sexuality can be understood in psychological terms, and what does the sexual behavior of a person can tell us about interpersonal relationships and home dynamics. What does our sexual behavior tell us about potentially the relationships that we had growing up and we have with our mothers and fathers? Understanding the role of our parents within our behavior and functioning in daily decision. and understanding mental health problems that can arise. For Sigmund Freud, the main one was neuroticism, but also other types of behaviors or patterns that we see psychologically. How do we understand those? It's important to understand that Sigmund Freud came himself from an environment. So when we talked about at the beginning about background of different psychologists, it's important to understand that he came also from a background where there was some turbulence in the way that he grew up and the relationships in his household, and how different family members within his close circle, his close family, how they interacted. And we often hypothesize that had a part of shaping the thought processes of Sigmund Freud and his own personal and professional development. Sigmund Freud allowed us to understand the importance of psychological factors such as repression, sublimation, and how those influence the person's daily behavior. What forces come into play in the decision making that a person takes? Is it their ego? Is it their superego? Is it an animalistic want and need, the id, or is it the more intellectual component of us that is going to triumph and ultimately decide the outcome of our behavior? Lots of those ideas that Sigmund Freud came up with allowed us later on to refine that in not just the field of psychology, but even in the field of neuropsychology. Some of these terms, or many of these terms, have taken different forms, shapes, titles as psychology developed from the work of Freud. However, some of the most basic and core ideas have moved forward as well. And even if some of those ideas are no longer widely accepted by mainstream psychology, nevertheless, Freud's investigation into this area, his way of systematically attempting to understand human behavior, his process of making a connection from the way we are growing up to the way that we behave, and the differentiation between different parts of our psyche and how those come into play when we behave, is absolutely tremendous and was absolutely brilliant. More members of his family became influential in psychology as well. His daughter became a well-known psychologist in the area of child psychology, and his son also became very successful. And so I think what's very important to understand is that these core theoretical constructs moved the field forward. And that's something that we want to consider and understand. With that in mind, before I go into the next leader, and some of you may suspect who that leader is, I would like to pause now and say that throughout the show today, I will make a very special and important announcement. And that is that my time with UBN has come to an end by taking now my show forward into mainstream radio. And starting from next week, Sunday at 8 p.m. Pacific time, my show, The Dr. Dee Show, will air on KABC 790 AM. And I am so thankful and grateful for the time that I have spent at UBN Radio, building the show, the idea of this program, and what it can do for the public and the population. And I look forward for you to continue to listen to my show on KABC 790 AM at 8 p.m. Every Sunday. Now, we're going to go to the next leader. Some of you may guess. Carl Jung. Carl Jung was also extremely influential in the field of psychology. And while many of the concepts and ideas, again, that Carl Jung came up with and developed are not something that actively is necessarily taught every day in mainstream psychology classes. And while some of those ideas have been more controversial, many of them have been still core and continue to be core to some of the understanding that we have in psychology. One needs to understand that psychology is a field that develops on exploration, and because it is a social field and it's the field of understanding the human mind and the psyche of an individual, it constantly takes different shapes and forms, and ideas are constantly augmented to be described one way or another. But excellent psychologists will use their knowledge of those past ideas and transform them and translate them into real and practical advice to their patients. So when individuals ask, well, what is the purpose of studying all these theories? What do these mean? Well, many of these theories then translate into not only understanding our patients better, but being able to choose which tools would work best, would be most effective for our patients. Many of the tools that are given to us in theory allow us to make a determination, along, of course, with appropriate assessment, of what is the mental health disorder that the person is suffering from, or what is the problem, the human problem. They might not have a full disorder, but they might have a functional problem, a temporary functional problem like family conflicts, marital problems that they need to overcome. And in a way, when a psychology student, a doctorate student studies the various theories, what occurs internally for the student, and hopefully what occurs, is the ability to analyze information, to look into the depth of a person, to consider various types of processes in the psyche that may contribute to the behavior of the person. And that is a very powerful thing. When we talk about Carl Jung, interestingly enough, his work was developed about the same time that Freud's work was developed. And there was some long-term relationship for a certain period of time between Freud and Jung, although in many ways they disagreed, philosophically disagreed about cognitive processes. The roots of their theories and what are the we call this etiologies, which is the roots of the problems that one sees, the mental health problems. What are those, and how those roots of those problems translate into the current expression of the problem? They really did disagree on that. And while Freud saw the way a person grows up, their dynamics with their parents, sexuality, while Freud saw those to be core. For Carl Jung, the role was not so much sexuality, but more of an understanding of the collective unconscious, and the role of it in inhibiting the ability of the individual to actualize themselves in a contemporary society. What does that mean? It means that for Carl Jung, it was how is a person able to function and express or actualize themselves best in the environment as a whole, in a society that has a collective unconscious. What does it mean? Societies have ways. According to Jung, society has ways of understanding the world, and certain types of fundamental beliefs or ways of operations, and various people attempt to function within those ways of understanding or ways of functioning in society. And so that premise was very different than the perspective that our home environment, our sexuality and our dynamics with our parents shape us. Today, of course, we know that it's a combination. It's a combination of how of fundamental beliefs in society and societal patterns. But we also know that it's our home environment and our interpersonal relationships and the way that we grew up and how we were treated as kids. And we also know that genetics have a role in the way that we live, and medical conditions have that, and so many other factors that fall into the complex picture of the final artistic expression of each human being. And a talented psychologist will take into consideration all of those. I think it's important to understand that psychology was not just designed there for individuals to pet each other, to pay someone to pat you on the shoulder and feel bad for you and comfort you in times of that you have doubt and feel bad about yourself. Of course, that good therapists, good psychologists support their patients and make sure that they provide them with an understanding of their situation. But the first and foremost job of a psychologist or goal is to take the right steps and guide their patient or their client towards a higher level of functioning, towards a better level of functioning psychologically, emotionally, cognitively, and behaviorally. It is not just about coming to therapy for many years and because you love the fact that your psychologist is listening to you and there's somebody that's listening to your pain. The goal should be making progress. And that's, by the way, one of the core fundamental aspects that a good psychologist will be evaluated for is, was there progress made with their patient? Now, of course, not everything is controlled. Patients make their own decisions. They may decide not to do the work that was agreed on in a therapeutic session. They may decide that they don't, that they want to make a change, that they may decide that not to accept what the psychologist is saying, or if there are other types of issues such as addiction, they may decide to go back to their addiction or eventually just go back because of precipitating stressors. So there's all kinds of reasons why therapy might not work, which is not always in the role of the psychologist. It takes two to tango, right? But it's important to understand, in essence, that's where the psychologist ideally would like to go. So we talked about Freud and we talked about Jung, and I would like to talk now about Pavlov. Pavlov is also very known. There's something called the Pavlovian response. So what is the Pavlovian response and why is it so famous? Well, Ivan Pavlov was one of the leader that established the main foundation for a major and fundamental area of therapy, and that is behavioral therapy. And how did he do that was by to understand how we can condition first dogs, but then ultimately, in some cases, humans, to produce a particular response. And by conditioning, in his experimentations, by conditioning dogs to salivate to the sound of a bell, in a way of associating food with an audio stimulus, right, the sound, Pavlov showed that the relationship between the stimulus and our actions and the memory of our responses to that certain stimulus could be quite powerful. What he showed is that we are trainable, dogs are trainable, and humans are trainable, and we tend to respond to conditioning. We can be conditioned physiologically and behaviorally to the sound or sight of a particular stimulus. Why do I say behaviorally and physically? Is because the dogs could salivate, which is a physiological response to a sound of a bell, although the sound of the bell was not the food itself. So that type of pairing showed just how powerful conditioning can be. Conditioning is something that's used every day. We might not think about it, but conditioning is used every day by companies who want you to buy products. We get conditioned. We get conditions to the sight of something that might affect us physiologically and behaviorally. How many people drive near McDonald's and start salivating? What do you think? How many people see a picture of ice cream that they like and they've had many times and they start feeling the taste of the ice cream in their mouth? How many people will produce a behavior based on conditioning that they have had with a particular product? Many times, and it can be very often. It's a very, very particular thing that we do. And so what's important to understand is that fundamentally changed the field of therapy because it taught us how we can use this type of process. Now that we know how it works better, how can we use that to the benefit of therapy? How can we use conditioning to therapeutically alter the behavior of individuals and by that help them develop better behavior? Another interesting psychologist that did phenomenal work that really opened the door to understand children in the most incredible way is Jean Piaget. And Jean Piaget, it's a foreign pronunciation of his name, has given us education on how childhood occurs and how childhood development occurs that fundamentally change the way that we understand children, the way that we understand their stages of development, and how we can use those to the benefit of learning and growth in various and specific age groups throughout time. Later on, Erik Erikson also made contributions to this area, but that also worked in tandem and side by side many times to Piaget's effort. His efforts to show distinct stages of development allowed us to understand that there's sort of something what we like to call windows of opportunities. And I've talked about that in the past, that developmentally our brain is wired to learn certain type of information and process certain type of information at different times, at a different rate and in a different way or different ability, depending on the age of the child. And so there are certain years where, for example, in early childhood, that our babies are able to capture sounds, actual vocal sounds, and thereby learning how to make those particular sounds, where that window of time, that narrow window of time, that's when our brain is capable to capture so easily those sounds and then know them for the rest of our lives. And if we did not learn those types of sounds, which translates to language later, of course, at that particular time, we may never be able to learn how to make those sounds. It's one of the reasons why certain languages use sounds that other languages cannot or do not use, and we would have real difficulty learning those types of sounds as we get older. In fact, it is hypothesized and believed that as babies, we're able to learn all sorts of sounds. And when we talk about the thousands of languages out there, there's just an incredible number of sounds that we technically are able to learn and produce as babies. But when we are not exposed to those sounds, our ability to learn those cease to exist, and we lose the ability to learn those sounds, and we stay with the sounds that we have captured, we have been exposed to, and eventually that we can practice as our language development continues. And so understanding the stages of development really allows us to be more effective with children, understand them better, know what their limitations are and what their strengths are at different stages of development, different ages. Understanding, for example, that when the psychosexual development occurs, it begins at around the age of 9, for example. You will notice that children at around the age of 9 not only physiologically begin very, very small changes of their puberty. That puberty is going to go on for another 2-3 years, right? It's not a sudden change. It is a gradual change, but it's not only a physiological change. Certain hormones increase, thereby changing the emotional behavior of the child. You're suddenly noticing that, and it's so natural. That change, by the way, is so natural. You can start noticing your child being more emotional, more tuned to boy-girl dynamics or the other sex, being aware more of the other sex. Also behaviors that have to do with self-expression. There's all types of changes that are happening that are just so very natural, and there's that kick of limbic processing where, you know, they're louder, they're more emotional, they're listening to music, and they have these flight of thoughts. And, you know, later on we describe that as in the teenage brain as, you know, them being the center of their own story, the center of their own world. Anybody ever met a narcissistic teenager? How about every normal teenager is a narcissistic teenager? Why? Because that's a stage. That is a developmental stage where they have this belief that they are the center of the story, and everything that's going on around revolves around them, but they are the center of the story. Okay? Where in reality it's not it. When they are the center of the story, everybody notices their tiny little pimple in the middle of their forehead. Everybody's noticing when they gained 2 pounds. You know, everybody judges them. Everybody's paying attention to how they sing or talk or dress, how awkward they get, right? And they get awkward physically, and they get awkward emotionally, and they're trying to mold themselves or become molded into the adult that they eventually will become years later. And so, as you could tell, this is a very particular stage of development. So understanding the development of children in the various stages is just so very, very important, and has been so, you know, it has changed the world. It has changed the world of psychology, and by that, it has changed the way psychologists help families, parents, children, and thereby improving substantially the quality of their life. And so we are to thank for the leaders who have done that. So the next one that I would like to touch on is Carl Rogers. Carl Rogers, in a way, basically shifted the focus from psychoanalysis, which we saw more in the Freudian style, to that deep investigation into the family dynamics that shape behavior, into a perspective that's more humanistic. That people, the people being treated, rather than the theory that should be treated, it should be coming from the perspective of the particular human that's being treated in the room. That the humane approach of that particular person and how they see the world through their eyes and what's important to them, it should be what is what should be the approach. It should be considered predominantly in the therapeutic setting. That is the client-centered treatment approach that was very revolutionary in a way, because the perspective was before that the science was bigger than the human. And in his approach, in some way, although that is a scientific approach as well, the human was bigger than the science, meaning we might have a theory and a hypothesis on what causes a person to behave one way or another, but ultimately it is the patient in the room, it is the client, their thoughts, their interests, their worldview that should fuel and determine the course of the therapy that's being given to them. And that's fundamentally was a very big change. In a way, it was also revolutionary in a sense that it challenged the authority. It challenged the authority or the place of the psychologist as an expert in the room, in a sense that it said, no, the therapist, and that's, by the way, two different fundamentally different approaches to psychology. One is about, the therapist is the expert, it's the know-it-all, it's the authority in the room, and the patient follows what the expert is saying, follows the lead. Well, where in the Rogerian approach, it's more of the patient is leading, in a sense, the therapy session and the counseling, and the therapist is following the cues and the guidance that comes, or the interests that come from the patient. And so that change of role and dynamics, maybe giving it a more of a collaborative approach of the therapist and patient, rather than the authoritative approach of an expert and a student, has really revolutionized the way that therapists were conducting therapy and doctors were dealing with their patients. And that was just a major, major change. There's one more theorist that I would like to touch today, and that's in the tribute to neuropsychology, of course. But before we touch on that, I want again to any one of us who's just joining the show perhaps now to share with you again the wonderful and exciting news that my show will be from now on airing on 7:90 a.m. KABC. I am very excited to join the family of KABC. It will be airing every Sunday live, 7:90 a.m. at 8 p.m. from 8 to 9 p.m. At night. And for my listeners who are outside of the Los Angeles area, all podcasts will be playing on the KABC website under the Dr. Dee Show. Again, the podcast will also be shared on Facebook and on my own website, www.drdgaines.com, so you can benefit from past and current episodes. Now, the person that I would like to share with you, or the one extra expert that has literally revolutionized the world now of not just psychology, but primarily neuropsychology, was Alexander Luria. Alexander Luria, who was a Russian Soviet neuropsychologist and a developmental psychologist, was one of the founders of what we call a cultural historical psychology. And he was a leader of a circle that, also leader of social circles and professional circles. And one of his main works, which was published in 1962, was called The Higher Cortical Functions in Men. It was a psychology textbook that has been translated in multiple languages and later on was supplemented with his book, The Working Brain, in the 1970s. His incredible work was also widely known for two amazing cases that he covered, very interesting cases. One of them was of a man who was highly advanced in memory, and his mind was a mnemonist mind. It's called the mind of a mnemonist. And then another one of a man that had a brain injury, which was called the man with a shattered world. What Luria did in his career is explain so basically, fundamentally, and scientifically the cortical functions, the higher cortical functions of the brain, how the brain works, and an area of the brain that is very fundamental to all sorts of brain injuries, the area that we call executive functions. And really was one of the first scientists to look in a very, very specific and be able to describe in a very, very detailed way our understanding of how the frontal lobe works, where the executive functions sit. His career was just produced such a wealth of scientific work that was published all over the world and discussed in all sorts of settings. He really, in a way, revolutionized the science of neuropsychology, and he created the path for so many neuropsychologists later to delve into various areas of cognitive functioning and explain those, describe those, and then go deeper and deeper into so many functions that the brain does. We're talking about general ones like attention and concentration, memory, but then he looked at other, but it opened the door into other areas that also have to do with various areas of the brain. So that really is, it opened the door to very, very complicated and wealthy development of knowledge. It's important to understand that what many of the concepts that Luria taught, and I think that's part of what's so amazing about his work, many of the explanations and clarifications that he gave to how the brain works are current and relevant today and widely accepted and taught. Some of my professional publications in the area of brain injury have touched on Luria's concepts, and those concepts have been fundamental to my understanding of how the brain works and the ramifications of brain injury. It's also very important to understand that he created also studies of that had to do with multiculturalism. So his interest in cultural variety and psychological expressions of cultural of various cultures was also an incredible contribution. It was interesting that his pursuit of this type of science was really just opened the door to how his brain was developing concepts and sharing them with the world. It's so his books now are very difficult to get a hold of. Some of especially the beginning work that he had, but much of his work is widely described and covered and discussed in basically hundreds and possibly thousands of professional publications. His extensive studies, as I said, in the frontal lobe focused on the 5 fundamental areas that cover then a lot of other sub-functions. He covered attention, memory, intellectual ability, emotional reactions, and voluntary movements. He also looked into areas of speech dysfunction, expressive speech, impressive speech, memory, intellectual ability, and personality development, and also conducted investigations into the area of child psychology. what's very important to understand is that the field of neuropsychology today is a very developed field with very sophisticated tools that allow us to investigate into the areas that I mentioned, but many others as well. And by using standardized measurements to look into those various cognitive areas, we are capable at looking to see where a person essentially stands as their functioning is compared to other individuals of similar age and ethnicity and educational level, and then gives us a profile of their cognitive functioning that, based on that profile, we're able to determine whether a person has what are they suffering from? Do they have a disorder? What type of disorder are we seeing? And based on that, we can make treatment recommendations. So the process of a neuropsychological evaluation is a very important process. With that in mind, I hope that you got well educated today on powerful and influential psychologists in the field. These have been the heroes of myself and many other psychologists and neuropsychologists who are doing great work every day in our field. With that in mind, again, I would like to share with you the great, amazing news. As I am thankful for the time that I spent on UBN Radio and have developed this show for the benefit of all of you and all the listeners who've been communicating with me how this show has been beneficial to them. At the same time, I am very excited to move forward and announce to you that the Dr. Dee Show will, starting next week on Sunday, September 11th, will be airing on KABC 790 AM every Sunday on KABC 790 AM from 8 p.m. to 9 p.m. Pacific time. You can also call into the show. You can write to me. Contact at drdgaines.com. The show podcast will be available on kabc.com and will also be available on my website. With that in mind, I hope you enjoyed all this information, and I will just share with you for the 2 minutes that we have 2 letter communications that I had from patients, as I promised. Actually, those are not from patients, but from listeners. That's very important to make that distinction. One listener asked me about, why is it important for me to know about whether I have a cognitive dysfunction or not, whether I have a brain problem? Why is that important for me to know? And so the most basic answer for that is that there's various reasons. There's quite important reasons why, if you suspect that you have a brain problem or a cognitive problem, that you need to be checked. The first reason is that you might be suffering from a serious condition that you do not know about that needs to be treated. Okay, so your brain needs to be checked on the most basic level to find out if there is something more urgent or sometimes life-threatening or anything that needs to be treated, okay? The second of all is because there are things to be done. First of all, you want to narrow it down. Is it really that I'm suffering from a problem or not? And if I do, to what extent? It might not be a major problem, and you might be able to get more answer and peace of mind about what you're going through. Sometimes it could be a psychological reason that makes us feel like we are cognitively not okay. And finally, because if you do suffer from a problem, there are various types of treatments that you can do. There are different kinds of services that you can get. And so getting an accurate picture, an accurate diagnosis of what you're suffering from allows for professionals to help you. And there's just so much out there that can be done for all sorts of cases, that you will now be exposed to ways that you can be helped without getting the proper diagnosis and help that you need. So, for the second question of my that I received was a question about, if I have a cognitive problem, should I hide it from my family or my spouse, or should I tell them about it? Well, Part of what we normally would like you to do, if you have, assuming that you have a good relationship with your family members, we would like your family members to be aware and know that there is a particular issue you're going through, because they can understand you better. Many times from experience of patients, knowing that the person is suffering from can alleviate a lot of the pressure and can show that maybe some of the communication issues have to do with the problem that the person is suffering from, and not just a negative personal agenda. And also because getting help and cooperation from the family is what makes successful therapy works. So with that in mind, I hope that I answered your questions. I'm wishing you a wonderfully blessed, healthy, intelligent, and empowering rest of your week. I look forward for you to join me at KABC 790 AM every Sunday night, 8 p.m. to 9 p.m. Best wishes to all of you, and stay tuned.
You're listening to the Dr. Dee Show about neuropsychology and well-being. Get the knowledge you must have to live a powerful, positive life. The Dr. Dee Show. Here for you.